On guys, this is Pat here, and let's talk about some really bad movies that came out so far this year. Now, 2020 has not really been a good year by any means for a lot of people, including myself. So, yeah. But one thing, like, even though some movies that I'm going to talk about are bad, I enjoy talking about bad movies more than I do talking about good movies, because, like, you can be more creative with the bad movies at least, because, let's face it, these filmmakers were not really that creative with their movies, so let's get started. At number 10, I am putting Dangerous Lies. This was a Netflix movie starring Camila Mendes from Riverdale in a thriller that's very generic, very cliched. It's almost borderline so bad it's good, but it's too cliche to even call it that. The fact that it's directed by a man named Michael Scott is just hilarious to me. Like, that just adds to the overall hilarity of it. I don't know. It's definitely don't watch it, but if you do, you might have a laugh with it. At number 9, I am putting You Should Have Left. And it should have been called You Shouldn't Have Watched. This movie has a few interesting ideas that it wants to throw at you, but it never really wants to develop them. Instead, it has awkward exposition, bland acting, just lackluster scares, a twist that's obvious, and the fact that it comes from someone in Hollywood who's actually, very prolific, who's been working in there for decades. The fact that he wrote this movie and directed this movie, the fact that David Koepp wrote this movie and directed it, it's honestly kind of sad, because this is like a first film for someone, and yet here's a director who's been working forever, and this is what he wants to do. And it's just kind of sad, actually. Like, it wants to be The Shining, and yet it's not. It's anything but. At number 8, Bloodshot. This movie is so goofy, and it's not even aware of how goofy it is. Vin Diesel, and he's completely CGI in various scenes. The action is awkward. It looks like it's out of a bad video game, honestly. It takes itself way too seriously. The acting is terrible. The story is terrible. It doesn't make any sense. Just no. Just stop. I don't want to deal with it anymore. At number 7 is Like a Boss. Two friends who have their business in trouble, and yet someone comes in and wants to save their business, and they learn they might be taking over the business overall. It's a movie that's stretched out to barely 80 minutes. Think about that. I have seen sitcom episodes that did this better. I have seen kids shows that have done this better. And yet you have talented actors all across the board doing nothing with it. You have Salma Hayek playing a cartoonish villain. You have everyone else just being generic, boring, not interesting. It's all scattershot throughout the entire movie, and it's 80 minutes. They stretched this thing to just make it into theaters, and they really shouldn't have put it in theaters, and they really shouldn't have made it. At number 6, I'm surprised that this is only number 6. Dolittle. Dolittle is only number 6 on my worst of the year list. Think about that. Dragon farts. I could just end it right there. But no. No, Robert Downey Jr. is terrible. Most of the voice acting is terrible. Michael Sheen's terrible. The visuals are terrible. The jokes are terrible. The plot is nonsensical. Characters appear and disappear without any question. And again, dragon farts. Who needs that in their life? No one. No one needs that in their life. Ever. So how bad is the rest of this list that Dolittle is only number 6? Think about that. At number 5, I am putting The Turning. This movie, it's a nothing movie. Chris Duckman said it was a nothing movie, and yeah, it's a nothing movie. Nothing happens, it's all build up, and then it ends. Nothing happens. The gothic scenery's fine, but nothing comes from that. The acting overall is mostly terrible from Mackenzie Davis and Finn Wolfhard. It's not scary. It relies heavily on the dream sequence trope, And that kind of started my whole vendetta against dream sequences. I should have mentioned this with You Should Have Left. They also really did dream sequences. And again, Hollywood, please stop with them. I'm going to talk about it with another movie on this list, but no more dream sequences. God damn it. And again, it's barely an ending. Like, just why? Why? Like, you didn't have time to finish this. This movie was sitting on the shelf for a year and a half. Seriously, look it up. And they didn't even think about going back into production to do reshoots to say, hey, we kind of need an ending to this movie. And they're like, no, we're good. I'm not. At number 4, Fantasy Island. Ugh. I honestly thought this would be my number 1. I really did. Oh, was I naive? Nearly everyone is terrible in this movie, with the exception of Maggie Q, Michael Pena. Everything else about this movie is bad. The other actors are terrible, like Lucy Hale. Forgot the other actors' names. But they're terrible. The movie just spends all the time just explaining how this stupid island works. And then it reveals a twist and doesn't really explain how that actually makes sense. Because it doesn't. And nothing in this movie is really that scary. And it's just so boring throughout. It's horribly paced because it's like, okay, here's Lucy Hale's dream sequence and here's Maggie Q's fantasy sequence. And there are these two brothers who are beyond obnoxious. And this other guy who wants to be in the army like his dad. And how is any of this scary? It's not. It's boring. And I actually made this joke in my Fantasy Island review that he was probably going to, this director who previously did Truth or Dare was probably going to make a horror movie about a magic 8-ball. Guess what? He's actually making a horror movie about a magic 8-ball. Stop it. Please stop it. Also like The Turning. This movie relies heavily on dream sequences too. Please stop it. At number 3, I am putting Capone. Man, this one was a letdown. I feel bad for Josh Trank over what happened with Fantastic Four. I mean, that was a terrible movie, but I feel bad for what happens. It's like, okay, so he's making this movie without a lot of studio interference, and it's going to be about the life of Al Capone, kind of. And Tom Hardy was going to play him. And it's like, I never really heard anything about it for years. It's like, was that movie still happening? And then it came out during this whole thing, and it's like, oh, it did happen. And I kind of wish it didn't. Tom Hardy is terrible in this movie. I said he was kind of mixed, because like there's a couple scenes where he's actually good. But most of the movie, he's just looking like this. And then when he sees someone from his past, he's like, and I just found it to be very insulting, honestly. Everyone else in this movie is just very flat. They're not really given much to do. And there's a weird fascination with Al Capone basically doing something he really shouldn't be doing with other people and should be doing in a bathroom. Ew. At number 2, The Last Days of American Crime. Honestly, the title of this movie sounds really interesting. It's just nothing in the movie is. And a lot of reviews I noticed for this movie. So this movie came out on Netflix a couple weeks after the killing of George Floyd and all the protests that sparked all over, not just the country, but all over the world, apparently. And Netflix decided to release this movie during this time, and a lot of reviewers said this was not a good time to release this movie. And they kind of said they're giving it a bad review because it's a bad time to release it. And I'm one of those people who's like, I'm trying not to let world events judge my opinions on movies. And I try to look at a movie, see what it is, and this movie shouldn't be judged because it came out the wrong time. This movie should be judged because it's terrible. It's ungodly boring. It's even more boring than Fantasy Island. I'll say that. This movie is 2.5 hours long, and barely anything happens. It's like, they introduce a cool concept, and then it's like, oh, well, it's like, cool concept. It's like, and then they immediately go to this very generic heist, which I'm like, it's boring. All the actors are terrible in this movie. The characters are so thinly written. Nothing happens. Nothing. Just why? But the number 1 worst movie of 2020 so far, Artemis Fowl. Disney is desperately trying to hold on to some of their movies. They want to release them in theaters like Mulan, Black Widow. But they said, no, we're throwing you to streaming, Artemis Fowl. Think about this. This movie was in production hell for 20 years. This movie had their first trailer in 2018. And it's finally being released in 2020 online. They knew what they were throwing at us. They knew. The acting is terrible. The story is terrible. The odd things that they throw in this movie are just odd. Like, the visuals are just creepy. Like, Josh Gad opening his mouth, eating dirt, and then popping it back out the other end. Judi Dench sounds like she's been smoking for 20 years. All the other actors are flat. The kid who plays Artemis Fowl is boring. He has no chemistry with Colin Farrell. And I didn't mention this in my initial review, but it's not really close to the book at all. And I didn't mention that because I never read the book, so I can't really judge it based on that. But I may have to check out the original book to see how much this movie screwed it up. So, yeah, Artemis Fowl. It's just foul. So, those are my picks for the top 10 worst movies of 2020. What do you think? What are some of the worst movies you've seen this year? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat, and stay safe.